A young woman in a pale gown once climbed upon the rooftop of the White House, not to wave with ceremony toward the people below, but to strike a match against the wind and light a cigarette. The sound of the city drifted upward, the distant hooves of carriages, the clamor of voices from Pennsylvania Avenue, the whistle of a train carrying its own cargo of ambition and fatigue. There she stood, her figure outlined against the great dome of the Capitol in the distance, her lips curling with smoke, her eyes bright with daring. It was not a gesture of necessity, but of freedom, as if she had found for a moment her own throne above the Republic. Before we begin, dear listener, I welcome you into this gathering of memories. Leave in the comments where and when you are listening so that these words may weave themselves into a shared tapestry of time across oceans and lands. And if you would, remember to press the subscribe button so that this channel may continue to carry these stories through the quiet of your evenings and the stillness of your nights. The image of a young woman smoking high above Washington fades, and we step back in time to the earliest breath of Alice Roosevelt. She was born in February of the year 1884, in a world already weighted with the name she carried, the name of Roosevelt that would echo through the century to come. Her father, Theodore Roosevelt, was at that time not yet the president known to every schoolchild, not yet the robust figure charging through the wilderness or the halls of power, but a man caught in private tragedy. Only 2 days after Alice was born, her mother, Alice Hathaway Lee Roosevelt, died in the family home. On that very same day, in another chamber of the house, Theodore's own mother also passed away. The child came into a household wrapped in mourning, and the father, overcome by grief, scarcely spoke of his late wife again. He would record her name with a cross in his diary and write simply, "The light has gone out of my life." Thus Alice, before she was old enough to recognize the faces that bent above her, was already bound to the shadows of loss. Raised for her earliest years more by relatives and by the household staff than by her father, she lived in a kind of twilight. Beloved, yes, but set apart, a living reminder of what had been lost. And it is said that from such beginnings often come the restless spirits, those who search in every corner for the light denied to them at birth. Her father, stricken by the double blow, retreated from New York and threw himself into the rough landscapes of the Dakota Badlands, where he sought healing in the saddle and in the cold frontier air. The baby Alice remained behind, a presence at once cherished and avoided, for she bore the name of the mother whose memory Theodore found too sharp to bear. Only later, when he remarried Edith Caro, did young Alice return to her father's daily circle, carried into the household that was now reconstituted with new children, new laughter, and a new balance of affections. What does it mean for a child to grow knowing her name is a constant echo of absence, to carry in every call of Alice not only her own identity, but also the ghost of the mother she would never know? Perhaps this question, unanswered, lingered through her life like the smoke of that cigarette above Washington, the sense that one's own existence must be claimed, not merely inherited. In those early years, Alice proved restless, willful, and bright. The other Roosevelt children, born of Edith, made a close-knit brood, but Alice often seemed half within, half without. She was clever, she was mischievous, and she was stubborn. Her stepmother, Edith, was a woman of order, preferring neatness, discipline, and quiet grace. And yet Alice burst with contrary impulses. She longed for freedom, for the thrill of doing what was forbidden. At times, Edith despaired of her. At times, Theodore, though loving, was too occupied with his own ascent into public life to resolve the storms that gathered within his firstborn. The house at Sagamore Hill, their Long Island estate, was a place of trees, gardens, and the scent of the sea, and there Alice ran wild. She would climb where she should not, speak when she should be silent, defy when she was expected to yield. She was clever enough to know how far she could push, and bold enough to test the boundary again and again. Perhaps it was in these gardens and hallways that she first learned the art of performance. that rebellion could draw the gaze of others, that daring could command attention more fiercely than obedience ever could. Theodore Roosevelt, both as father and later as president, admired vigor and spirit. Yet in Alice he encountered not the rugged discipline of his Rough Riders, but the restless defiance of a young woman who refused to be ordered. He would later say, half in jest and half in resignation, that he could either run the country or attend to Alice, but he could not possibly do both. Those words, quoted endlessly in newspapers, spoke to the peculiar role she came to occupy. Not merely daughter, not merely socialite, but a spectacle in her own right, woven into the story of her father's America. But in these first chapters, we find her still young, watching, testing, unsettled. We imagine her in the dim light of the Sagamore Hill parlor, a book perhaps in her hand, her eyes shifting now and then to see if anyone noticed her. Did she long for her father's gaze, or for a freedom that no gaze could restrain? It is difficult to know. What we do know is that when she stepped later into the great stage of Washington, she did so with a force that had been tempered in these very halls of childhood, the will to stand apart, the desire to turn loss into vitality, the unyielding need to be her own creation. The hallways of her youth still echo. We hear the creak of wooden stairs at night, the distant crash of the sea on Long Island shores, the sound of a girl's laughter carrying through a house both beloved and restrained. The child grows, and with her grows the tension between memory and possibility. And in that lingering sound of laughter, we leave this first glimpse, an image unresolved, a child wandering through corridors where the lamps burn low, her shadow stretched long upon the walls. The sound of her laughter fading down the dark corridor lingers, as though carried by a draft through the half-open doorways of Sagamore Hill. And from that faint echo we move into her girlhood, a period shaped not only by the house itself, but by the watchful presence of Edith Roosevelt. Edith, her stepmother, was a woman of refined discipline, a caretaker of order, one who valued decorum as much as affection, who believed that children could flourish if their spirits were gently pressed into proper form. To the younger Roosevelt children, this structure seemed natural, but to Alice, who already bore the restless mark of loss and longing, it felt like a net that pressed too tightly. And so, the girl who had once wandered the halls with a book in her hand began to fashion herself into a presence that could not be contained, even beneath Edith's careful eye. There are tales that in her youth she became known for testing every rule that was laid before her. If told to sit, she would stand. If told to remain quiet, she would find a way to make her voice heard. Some say she could never bear to be invisible, that from the very earliest years her will was shaped by the sense that her name itself, Alice, carried too much silence, too much association with the mother she never knew. And so she carved her own noise into the world, her own brightness, her own defiance. Was it rebellion? Or was it a plea for recognition in a household where her place was never quite secure? The answer remains suspended between memory and conjecture, like a candle flame trembling in a draught. Her father, now rising in political stature, admired determination and boldness in men. He praised the strong handshake, the hearty laugh, the unyielding spirit of the hunter and the soldier. In Alice he found a mirror of vitality, yet twisted into a form less easily celebrated, for she was not to be trained like a cadet, nor sent off into the wilderness as he once had gone. She was his daughter, and though he loved her deeply, he often recoiled from the disorder she brought into the rooms of his life. It was Edith who bore the brunt of managing her. Edith who insisted upon lessons and manners. Edith who sought to correct the sharp edges of her wit. Yet Alice resisted with a ferocity that even Edith's patient will could not fully tame. There is something deeply human in the way a child resists what is imposed upon them, in the way identity sharpens itself against restraint. Imagine the garden paths of Sagamore Hill with their gravel crunching beneath small shoes. Imagine Alice, older now, carrying herself with the awareness that eyes were always upon her. She learned, as many young women in that age did, that every movement could be judged. Yet unlike most, she discovered that judgment itself could be wielded as a tool. If society insisted upon watching, she would give them a spectacle. If Edith scolded her for speaking out of turn, she would craft her speech into wit so sharp that it left an impression no rebuke could erase. By her teenage years, she had become both admired and feared within her own family circle. Her half-siblings, though close in age, did not always understand her need to stand apart. They laughed with her, but they also shrank back when her tongue cut too close. For Alice had already begun to master the art that would later make her notorious in Washington, the art of language as both shield and sword. A careless phrase could be turned into a jest that drew laughter from all around, yet beneath the laughter lay the unmistakable sting of exposure. She could disarm, but she could also wound, and sometimes, as the stories tell, she did both at once. One might wonder whether such sharpness came from her father's blood, for Theodore himself was known for his biting remarks and his fearless opinions. But in Alice, the wit was less a matter of conviction and more a matter of survival. To exist within the Roosevelt household, to exist under the long shadow of her mother's memory and the vigilant gaze of her stepmother, she needed a weapon that could ensure she was never dismissed, never overlooked. And so words became her companions, words spoken quickly, words crafted with daring, words that unsettled those who would rather have seen her obedient and silent. Washington society, when she began to appear in its drawing rooms, found this combination both intoxicating and unsettling. She was tall, striking, with a face that carried hints of the sorrowful mother she never knew, yet her eyes shone with irreverence. In a city where young women of good families were expected to glide softly through the season of introductions, Alice strode. She laughed loudly. She argued boldly. She asked questions that others would not dare. Those who hoped to tame her soon discovered that her spirit bent for no one. Yet in quiet moments, perhaps she still carried the mark of solitude. For rebellion, no matter how brightly displayed, often grows from a seed of loneliness. Did Alice ever lie awake in the high rooms of Sagamore Hill, listening to the wind through the trees, wondering what it meant to be the child who bore the name of absence? Did she question whether her daring acts were her own free will, or whether they were the inevitable dance of someone trying to outpace the ghost of a mother never known? The question has no answer, and perhaps that is its weight. For in every laugh of Alice's, there was both joy and defiance. In every scandalous act to come, there would be both freedom and a shadow. Her girlhood, framed by Edith's restraint and Theodore's distance, was a crucible in which the wildest first daughter began to take shape. The hallways of Sagamore Hill grow dim in memory, the sound of Alice's quick footsteps fading down the staircase. Outside, the night air smells of salt and pine, and the sea strikes its steady rhythm against the shore. A window stands open, and in it we glimpse the girl, half child, half woman, leaning out into the dark, the cool wind stirring her hair. Does she dream of escape? Does she dream of triumph? We cannot know. We only know that she is restless, and that restlessness will carry her forward into the world's gaze. And it is with this image, the figure of a young girl leaning out into the sea wind, her laughter mingling with the night, that we leave this chapter unresolved, waiting for the dawn of her first true steps into society. The figure of the girl leaning from the window, the sea wind stirring her hair, remains with us as the night turns slowly toward dawn, and with dawn comes the beginning of her presence in Washington society. The season of her introduction was awaited with curiosity, for she was no ordinary debutante, no fragile ornament to be placed delicately upon the social stage. She was Alice, the daughter of Theodore Roosevelt, a man who even then was striding toward the highest seat in the Republic. And so when she first appeared in the parlors and drawing rooms of the Capitol, it was as if a new star had risen, bright and unpredictable, a star that refused to follow the careful constellations mapped out by others, the sound of carriage wheels upon the streets of Washington, the glow of gaslight in the evenings, the hush of conversation in grand homes. All of this formed the setting for her early appearances. Alice entered with gowns that drew the eye, with laughter that filled the air, and with a confidence that startled those who expected a young woman to be quiet, modest, and deferential. She was neither modest nor deferential. She carried herself as though the room belonged to her, and perhaps in some ways it did, for wherever she went, she was the one most watched, the one most spoken of afterward. The newspapers quickly caught her scent. They described her with fascination, for she embodied contradictions that were difficult to contain. She was undeniably elegant, yet she was mischievous. She was the daughter of the president-to-be, yet she seemed unwilling to bend to the careful expectations of that role. Soon caricatures of her appeared in print, recounting her quips and her gestures, each story adding to her legend. In a city accustomed to measured propriety, she became the figure everyone wished to glimpse, the name everyone repeated at their tables. What did it mean to be watched so closely? Some young women might have shrunk beneath such scrutiny, but Alice discovered how to thrive within it. She understood that attention could be mastered, that it could be turned from burden into instrument. When they watched her, she performed more boldly. When they gossiped, she gave them more to whisper about. Her defiance became her currency, and she spent it freely. It is tempting to see in this a young woman intoxicated by fame, but perhaps it was also survival. Her way of ensuring she was never again eclipsed by silence, never again confined to the shadow of a mother's absence or a father's grief. Among the many tales of this period are the descriptions of her sharp tongue. She could slice through the pretenses of a conversation with a remark so quick, so unexpected, that even those she wounded often laughed in spite of themselves. One evening, she was asked why she so often defied convention, why she seemed unable to remain within the expectations of young ladies of her station. She is said to have replied with a smile, "If you haven't got anything nice to say about anybody, come sit next to me." Whether the words are exactly hers or embroidered by the journalists who adored her, they captured the essence of her presence. She was not a figure of demure silence, but of biting wit, an oracle of both charm and danger. It is in these years that her taste for the unusual companions and unusual amusements became known. The most famous of these was her beloved pet snake, a green reptile she named Emily Spinach. She carried it in her handbag to the shock and delight of those who discovered it coiled within. The very image of the president's daughter opening her purse to reveal a snake was enough to set the city's tongues wagging. And yet, behind the shock, there was symbolism. For what is a serpent in the company of a young woman but an emblem of knowledge, temptation, and danger? In a society that expected her to embody purity and restraint, Alice instead carried the symbol of disruption itself, curling and alive in the palm of her hand. The snake was not her only gesture of defiance. She smoked cigarettes at a time when few women of her class dared to be seen doing so. She rode in automobiles at reckless speeds, a pastime still new and frowned upon by the guardians of propriety. She wagered at horse races. She bet upon games. She embraced every pursuit that blurred the lines between the roles assigned to men and those imposed upon women. Each act, though scandalous to some, was a declaration of selfhood. Alice was not content to sit quietly at the edge of the ballroom. She demanded the center. Yet with every act of rebellion, there lingered a question. Was she merely playing, indulging in the delight of shocking her elders, or was she striving for something more enduring? Was she attempting to carve out a new vision of womanhood, one that did not bow before custom? Or was she simply living each day as fully as she could, without regard for what the future might hold? The truth, perhaps, lies between these possibilities. For Alice never declared herself a reformer. She never sought the path of organized women's rights. But by her very refusal to conform, she embodied the possibility of freedom, and in doing so became an unwitting symbol of rebellion for others who watched from the margins. Washington could not ignore her, neither could the White House. As her father ascended from vice president to president after the assassination of William McKinley in 1901, Alice became not only the most visible young woman in the city, but in the nation. The White House, once a place of sober politics, now held within its walls a figure of dazzling unpredictability. And the people, weary at times of politics, delighted in following her antics. They called her Princess Alice, as if to capture the strange fusion of democracy and royalty that her life seemed to represent. She was not elected, she held no office, and yet she was a sovereign presence. And still, in quieter moments, one wonders what she felt as she lay awake in her room at night, when the lamps had been extinguished and the city had grown still. Did she feel satisfaction at her triumphs, or did she feel the hollowness that often accompanies applause? Did she ever ask herself whether the snake in her purse, the cigarette on her lips, the laughter in her voice, were enough to fill the absence she had carried from birth? The answer remains hidden, as so much of her inner life does. What is left to us are the echoes. The flash of her smile in photographs, the lines quoted by newspapers, the gasps and laughter of audiences both approving and scandalized. From these fragments, we piece together an image of a young woman who refused to be silent, who claimed the stage as her own. And so the murmur of Washington drawing rooms becomes the final sound of this chapter, the hush of voices carrying her name, repeated again and again, as if trying to capture a figure who could never quite be contained. The murmur of Washington drawing rooms lingers, voices repeating her name as though trying to hold her in place. And from that sound we slip into the whisper of something stranger, the soft hiss of scales against fabric. For Alice, never content to be defined by custom, carried with her a companion that startled and amused the city, a small green snake she named Emily Spinach. It was not hidden in some far-off terrarium, but carried in her handbag, coiled and silent until revealed to astonished eyes. Society recoiled and laughed in equal measure, for in this simple gesture Alice had once again turned expectation on its head. Why a snake, one wonders? Perhaps because it was alive, unpredictable, unsettling, qualities she herself cultivated. Or perhaps because it was a symbol older than any republic, a creature that carried with it echoes of temptation, of hidden wisdom, of danger wrapped in beauty. To present such a creature at a dinner table, or to let it slip into conversation by surprise, was to remind those around her that she was not to be domesticated. She was the president's daughter, but she would not be bound to embroidery hoops and whispered conversations. She carried a serpent, and in doing so she carried her own Declaration of Independence. The newspapers, delighted by the story, spread the image far and wide. Children whispered of Alice's snake as though it were a fairy tale creature. Adults repeated the tale with a mixture of admiration and alarm. Each retelling added to the mythology. In a capital filled with stiff conventions, her handbag became a stage, and Emily Spinach its star. Yet beneath the laughter there lingered something more, a recognition that Alice had mastered the art of scandal without shame, that she could take even the most shocking detail and turn it into her signature. But the snake was only one expression of her defiance. Cigarettes appeared between her fingers at a time when women were rarely seen smoking in public. She inhaled deeply, not only the smoke but the power of being observed, the thrill of breaking a rule and watching it crumble before her. She rode in automobiles with the wind in her hair, engines roaring like declarations of a new century. She placed wagers at horse races, a pastime considered improper for her sex and her station. Each act, minor on its own, gathered into a pattern. Alice would not be told what to do. It was not mere rebellion for its own sake. There was wit in it, humor, performance. She seemed to understand that her very role as daughter of the president required her to be visible, and she chose to make that visibility her own. Others in her position might have shrunk from the constant gaze. Alice leaned into it, magnified it, even directed it. When the crowd wished her to play the role of modest maiden, she played instead the jester, the rebel, the sovereign. It was a role that unsettled Washington, but it also delighted it, for who could resist watching a young woman who treated rules as playthings? The White House itself became a kind of theater. Guests never knew what to expect. Would Alice make a remark so sharp it silenced the table? Would she slip her snake from her handbag to coil upon the linen? Would she disappear suddenly, only to be found racing through the city in a new automobile? The uncertainty itself was part of her charm. The Capitol, for all its politics, was hungry for diversion, and Alice supplied it in abundance. Yet one must pause to ask, beneath the laughter, what did Alice feel? To be always watched, always quoted, always interpreted. Was this freedom or another kind of cage? Did the snake in her handbag feel like a talisman of control, proof that she could shape her image, or was it a constant reminder that she could never escape the eyes upon her? She would never have said. Her face, in photographs of the time, shows both amusement and distance, as if she were performing not only for the audience, but for herself as well. Her father, Theodore Roosevelt, half admired and half despaired of her. He loved vitality. He cherished courage. But he also bore the burden of public office, and Alice's antics were both a jewel in his crown and a thorn in his side. He is said to have remarked that he could run the country, or he could attend to Alice, but he could not do both. The quip reveals the strain she brought to the household, but also her irresistible presence. She was impossible to ignore. High society, too, was caught in ambivalence. Some adored her for her boldness, others scolded her for her impropriety. Yet whether in admiration or disapproval, all kept her name upon their lips. And perhaps that was her truest success. She ensured that no one could forget her, that no gathering could proceed without her presence looming in some form. One evening, it is said, when asked why she carried Emily's spinach, she replied with that characteristic blend of wit and mockery, because the snake was as green as spinach and as thin as her Aunt Emily. The remark, cruel in its jest, revealed her gift for turning every question into theater, every rebuke into a performance. Even family became material for her tongue. The snake, thus, was not only a pet, but a prop, a symbol, a living joke at society's expense. And so we find her in these years, a young woman seated at banquets with a serpent in her bag, her laughter rising above the din of conversation, her cigarette smoke curling toward the chandeliers. The city buzzes with her name, newspapers repeat her every quip, fathers warn their sons, mothers shake their heads, and yet all eyes remain fixed upon her. Still, as the evening wanes and the lights dim, one can imagine her retreating to her own room, the handbag set aside, the snake resting in its small enclosure, the laughter fading into silence. Did she lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering whether the attention she had courted was enough to fill the emptiness of her earliest years? Or did she sleep soundly, content in the knowledge that she had once again bent the world to her will? The truth is, as coiled and elusive as Emily Spinach herself, and it is with that image, the small snake coiling in the half-light, silent, mysterious, that we end this chapter, the hiss of scales leading us onward to the next stage of Alice's daring life. The hiss of scales fades into silence, and from that silence rises the faint crackle of a match. We see her again, Alice high above the city on the roof of the White House, lifting a cigarette to her lips, the flame reflecting briefly in her eyes before the smoke drifts into the night air. Below her, Washington stretches out in its solemn geometry, the Capitol dome gleaming in the distance, the lamps along Pennsylvania Avenue glowing like strings of pearls laid out upon dark velvet. She inhales not only the smoke, but the sense of daring that comes from breaking yet another rule. For in those days, women of her standing did not smoke, and if they did, it was hidden away, never in the open, never so brazenly in sight of the sky. Yet Alice did, as though the stars themselves were her companions, as though the city were her stage. This was only one of the many ways she sought to live, not within boundaries, but beyond them. The new century was just beginning, and with it came inventions that promised both wonder and alarm. Among these was the automobile, a machine that to most still seemed dangerous, unrefined, and suited only for daring men willing to brave its noise and speed. But Alice, with her hunger for novelty, climbed eagerly into these rattling carriages of steel, hair whipping in the wind as she urged the driver faster. To ride through Washington in an automobile was to court scandal. To do so, as the president's daughter, was to transform scandal into spectacle. She laughed at the shock of passers-by, delighted in the blur of trees and houses rushing past. Speed was freedom, and freedom was her lifeblood. There were wagers, too. At horse races, she placed bets with a casualness that unsettled those who believed young women should remain untainted by money's lure. At gatherings, she joined in games, never timid, never willing to play the quiet spectator. Risk itself seemed to call to her. The risk of losing, the risk of being judged, the risk of stepping outside the safe borders drawn around her sex and her station. Each risk was a spark, and Alice was drawn to sparks as a moth to flame. It is easy to view these acts as frivolous, as mere antics of a restless young woman. Yet behind them lay something more profound. In a society that held women firmly in their place, each cigarette, each race, each bet was a declaration, unspoken but undeniable. I will live as I choose. Was she aware of the political undercurrent of her defiance? Perhaps not in any deliberate sense. She did not march for suffrage, nor did she align herself with reform movements. But she embodied rebellion in her own fashion, through living boldly in a world that asked her to be small. And in this embodiment she became a symbol, though not always one she claimed for herself. Her father, now president, must have watched these spectacles with a mixture of pride and exasperation. Theodore Roosevelt relished vigor and courage, but in Alice he saw vigor turned sideways, courage unbound by duty. He worried, he scolded, he laughed, and still she went her way. The White House was his domain, yet Alice carved her own dominion upon its roof, in its drawing rooms, across its lawns. Guests came to see not only the president, but also his daughter, whose antics filled the newspapers almost as often as his policies. And in this curious partnership of image, both father and daughter became larger-than-life figures in the American imagination. The public adored her. Crowds gathered to glimpse her, and when she traveled, thousands turned out to see Princess Alice, as she was called. Her name adorned hats, songs, even dolls. She was at once a scandal and a sensation, condemned by some, adored by many. Perhaps this adoration spurred her to push further, to seek ever greater thrills, for once a life is lived in the gaze of others, the gaze itself becomes addictive, and Alice had been raised from infancy in a household where absence and presence, silence and attention defined her very sense of being. It was only natural, perhaps, that she should seek not silence but spectacle. Yet one must wonder, in the quiet of her own thoughts, whether she ever felt the burden of it all. Did the cigarette on the roof comfort her, not only because it defied convention, but because it offered a moment of solitude in the open air, away from the endless watching? Did the speed of the automobile give her not only thrills, but also an escape, however brief, from the weight of her name and her lineage? To live so visibly is also to live with little refuge. Behind the bold laughter, there may have been moments of exhaustion, when even Alice longed for a quiet corner where no one spoke her name. But such corners were rare. Her life was a series of stages, each brighter than the last, and on each stage she performed, sometimes joyfully, sometimes recklessly, always memorably. Those around her who expected obedience found instead a whirlwind. Those who sought decorum discovered mischief. She was unpredictable, and unpredictability itself became her signature. And so we leave her here, upon the roof of the White House, cigarette smoke rising into the night, the faint roar of an automobile drifting up from the streets below, the murmur of wagers still lingering in her laughter. The air is alive with her presence, daring, restless, defiant. The smoke does not vanish, it curls, it drifts, it lingers. And in that curling smoke we see the path leading forward into grander scenes still, into banquets where she dazzled diplomats, into gatherings where her laughter carried across continents, into the strange dance of politics and spectacle that became her life's stage. The smoke drifts upward, curling and dissolving into the night, and as it fades we find it giving way to another scent, softer and more refined, the fragrance of flowers arranged upon banquet tables, roses and lilies standing tall in crystal vases, mingling with the aroma of polished wood, candle wax, and rich foods prepared for the gatherings of state. The White House, already a theater for Alice's mischief, also became the stage upon which she dazzled foreign dignitaries, statesmen, and ambassadors. At these grand dinners, she was not merely a daughter seated politely at the edge. She was a figure of magnetism, a presence who could alter the mood of an entire hall with her laughter or her silence. It was here that Alice transformed from local scandal to national enchantment. For the diplomats who came expecting only stiff formality and political discourse, discovered in the president's daughter a creature of wit and unpredictability. She engaged them boldly, sparring with words as if she were their equal, turning polite conversation into an art of provocation and amusement. Some left bewildered, others charmed, all remembering her. And in the soft glow of chandeliers, with the hum of music in the background, Alice Roosevelt became a diplomat of her own making, though one who obeyed no rules of protocol. Consider the effect she had on the foreign press. Stories of her antics crossed oceans. In capitals far away, her name was whispered as a symbol of American boldness, a living embodiment of the nation's youthful energy. At a time when the United States was still defining its place among the powers of the world, Alice projected an image at once daring and captivating. She was not sent as an envoy, and yet she was received as one. Her every word and gesture interpreted as if it carried the weight of policy. Her father may have wielded the language of treaties and military strength, but Alice carried something equally potent: fascination. In 1905, she was chosen to accompany a delegation to Asia, a journey that would become one of the crowning displays of her influence. Imagine her aboard the great ships, the ocean wind carrying her laughter across the decks, the waves beating steady rhythms against the hull. In Japan, the Philippines, China, and Korea, she was received with fanfare. Crowds pressed to see her, leaders welcomed her with curiosity, and newspapers chronicled her every step. She wore gowns of striking beauty, spoke with the candor that was her hallmark, and left in her wake a trail of both admiration and controversy. The journey itself became a legend, in part because Alice brought with her the same reckless spirit she had shown on the White House roof. On shipboard, she shocked her companions by sliding down banisters, by jumping into the ship's swimming pool fully clothed, by teasing and mocking with fearless humor. On land, she met princes and emperors, carrying herself as though the world belonged to her. This perhaps was the most shocking of all, that she carried into the courts of Asia the same unflinching independence she displayed in Washington drawing rooms. To some, it was unbecoming. To others, it was refreshing. But to all, it was unforgettable. There is a tale often told of her in the Philippines when she and several companions leapt into a fountain, splashing and laughing like children, while the startled hosts looked on in disbelief. Another of her lighting firecrackers in Manila, delighting in the noise as if it mirrored her own spirit. Such stories traveled quickly, feeding the image of a young woman who lived by her own code. Yet behind the laughter and the outrage, one perceives something deeper, a kind of diplomacy that was not in books or treaties, but in spectacle, in charm, in the ability to captivate an audience across cultures. And yet, one might ask, was she conscious of her role as representative of her nation, or was she simply herself, unrestrained, unaware, or uninterested in how her actions might be interpreted abroad? The question lingers, for Alice left no record of carefully plotted strategy. She was no deliberate architect of foreign policy, but she was a natural force, and natural forces, whether storms or stars, alter the landscapes they touch. Her father, Theodore Roosevelt, may have grumbled at her excesses, but he could not deny the publicity she brought. At a time when America's influence was expanding, Alice's dazzling presence abroad became part of the story. She embodied an America that was young, bold, irreverent, unwilling to bow to ancient hierarchies. And whether this image was flattering or scandalous, it was effective. She made people talk, and in diplomacy, being remembered can be as valuable as being respected. Back in Washington, her return was greeted with the same fascination that had followed her departure. She brought with her souvenirs, stories, and above all, the aura of someone who had crossed oceans and returned as a legend. The newspapers adored her, chronicling her adventures with both admiration and mockery. The public, already captivated, now saw her as more than the president's daughter. She was an international figure, a woman who could not be confined to parlor rooms and propriety. But again, in the quiet of reflection, one wonders, did Alice ever feel the weight of her role? Did she sense that her laughter and mischief had become entwined with the very image of her country? That her jokes and gestures might ripple into interpretations she never intended? Or was she content simply to be herself, to live each moment with the fullness of defiance? The fragrance of banquet flowers lingers, mingling now with the scent of travel, salt air, incense from foreign temples, the smoke of distant fireworks. Alice sits at a long table, her face illuminated by candlelight, her snake perhaps left behind for the evening, her wit sharp as ever, her presence impossible to ignore. The music swells, glasses clink, voices murmur in many languages, and all the while she shines at the center, both admired and feared, both scandalous and enchanting. And as the music fades, as the banquet draws to a close, we leave her in that glow of candlelight, her laughter echoing faintly against the walls, unanswered, unresolved, as if waiting for the next stage of her restless journey. The music of the banquet fades, the candlelight dims, and in its place rises another sound, softer, more intimate, the mingling tones of laughter exchanged between two sharp minds. It was in this period of her young womanhood that Alice encountered the man who would become her companion in both rivalry and affection. Nicholas Longworth, congressman from Ohio, older than she by more than a decade, known for his charm, his indulgences, and his capacity for wit that nearly matched her own. Their first meetings were not marked by gentle courtship, but by contests of cleverness, as if each sought to measure the other's tongue and spirit. Washington society, always hungry for stories, soon delighted in the spectacle of their banter. Alice, accustomed to besting her peers with her words, found in Longworth someone who could parry her thrusts, who could return her jokes with equal sharpness. He was not overawed by her celebrity, nor cowed by her father's shadow. Instead, he treated her as an equal in mischief, and perhaps it was this equality that intrigued her most. Their exchanges became legendary, their laughter carrying across parlors and drawing rooms, like dueling instruments finding harmony in contradiction. Yet beneath the laughter there was also calculation. For Alice, marriage was not merely a matter of affection, it was also a stage upon which the expectations of her era pressed heavily. She was admired, notorious, beloved by the public, but she was also expected to wed. To many, Nicholas seemed an unlikely choice. He was older, already known for his fondness for wine, for music, for pleasures less austere than the Roosevelt ideal. He carried a reputation that some whispered was reckless, but perhaps that was precisely why Alice was drawn to him. He, too, lived with a disregard for convention, though his was gentler, less flamboyant, more resigned. Together they formed a pair that society could not ignore, bound by wit and by the shared delight of confounding others. When news of their engagement spread, it became not merely a family matter, but a national event. Newspapers adorned their pages with speculation, gossip, and anticipation. For Alice was not an ordinary bride, and her wedding would not be an ordinary union. The day itself, February of 1906, became a spectacle unlike any the White House had seen. Over 1,000 guests attended, including cabinet members, senators, diplomats, and dignitaries from around the world. The East Room was transformed into a vision of flowers, music, and grandeur, and the crowd outside the gates swelled into the thousands, eager to catch even a glimpse of the procession. Imagine the scene. The chandeliers glowing with steady brilliance, the air alive with the hum of voices, the rustle of gowns, the polished shoes upon marble. Alice, radiant in her gown of delicate satin, a rope of pearls at her throat, walked with the calm assurance of someone who knew she was the focus not only of a wedding, but of a nation's gaze. Nicholas stood waiting, dignified yet smiling, his reputation both challenged and confirmed by the sheer audacity of their union. As they spoke their vows, the room seemed to lean forward, as though history itself were listening. It was said that the White House had never hosted so grand a wedding, and perhaps never would again. Guests carried away flowers as souvenirs, the press filled columns with descriptions, and the name Alice Roosevelt Longworth was sealed into the annals of American memory. The marriage joined not only two people but also two dynasties of influence, Roosevelt and Longworth, binding politics and society in a union as much symbolic as personal. Yet as with all unions that dazzle, beneath the glitter lay shadows. For though their wit and charm drew them together, the differences between them also marked their lives. Alice was restless, vibrant, perpetually seeking attention and novelty. Nicholas was more measured, indulgent, often resigned. Their bond was not one of seamless harmony, but of constant tension, a dance of affection and distance, laughter and quiet hurt. She was rumored to stray. He was known to drink, and yet their partnership endured, perhaps because each offered the other something no one else could, a companion willing to share in both rebellion and ridicule. One wonders what Alice felt as she lay that night in the aftermath of her great wedding, the echoes of music still ringing in her ears, the scent of flowers lingering in her gown. Did she feel she had triumphed, had bent the entire nation to witness her moment, or did she feel, beneath the satin and pearls, a flicker of doubt, the knowledge that the ceremony was but a beginning to a story more complicated, more uncertain? Weddings, after all, are only preludes. The true tale begins afterward, when the guests depart and the lights are dimmed. The wedding gifts, some said, were among the most lavish ever received in America. Jewels, treasures, rare porcelains, tokens of esteem from foreign powers, all poured in as though Alice herself were royalty. Yet what use are such treasures in the long sweep of a marriage, when laughter turns to silence, or when companionship falters beneath the weight of expectation? The jewels gleamed, but they could not promise joy. For now, though, the story remains at its height. A young woman, once a restless girl in the halls of Sagamore Hill, Now the bride who had commanded a nation's attention, who had stood in the East Room of the White House with all the world watching. The music fades, the guests disperse, the carriages roll away into the night. Alice and Nicholas are left alone, bound by vows and by spectacle, stepping into the uncertain dance of a shared life. And so we close this chapter with the faint sound of music still echoing, a bride's laughter mingling with the applause of 1,000 voices, unresolved, as though carried by the wind into the next chapter of her restless journey. The music of the wedding lingers faintly, like a melody remembered after the orchestra has gone silent, and from its fading notes we step into a quieter chamber, the domain of married life. The East Room of the White House had been filled with brilliance, its chandeliers and flowers dazzling the guests, but married life unfolds not in ballrooms, but in private spaces, in the small rooms where light falls unevenly and voices carry differently when no crowd is listening. For Alice Roosevelt Longworth, whose life had always thrived on spectacle, the shift from stage to chamber was no simple passage. Nicholas Longworth was, by many accounts, a man of charm. His wit and good humor had matched Alice's in public, and his easy manner softened her sharper edges, at least for a time. He was also indulgent, fond of music, of wine, of pleasures that allowed him to glide through the world rather than batter against it as Theodore Roosevelt had done. For some, this made him appealing, even refreshing. For others, it marked him as careless. For Alice, he was both companion and foil, a man she could spar with, laugh with, but also someone whose ways often clashed with her relentless need to command attention. Their home became another kind of salon, a place where politics and society intermingled, where Alice entertained guests with the same force she once commanded at White House banquets. Yet within these walls, the tension of their differences deepened. Nicholas, though witty, was more traditional in his ambitions. He sought to rise steadily in the House of Representatives, to climb the political ladder with careful steps, to cultivate alliances quietly. Alice, on the other hand, relished the role of provocateur. She did not wish to smooth over disputes, but to ignite them, to be the spark that unsettled a room. Where Nicholas practiced diplomacy, Alice practiced disruption. This difference grew into a source of strain. Though bound by marriage, they often lived parallel lives. He pursuing the steady rhythms of political service, she pursuing the unpredictable currents of social influence. Rumors circulated, as they always did around her, of flirtations and affairs. Nicholas, too, was whispered about, his fondness for drink and companionship drawing murmurs of impropriety. Yet neither seemed destroyed by these rumors. Perhaps they accepted them as part of the world they inhabited, as inevitable as gossip itself. What did Alice feel in these years of marriage? Did she ever wish for the comfort of harmony, or was she sustained by the very tension that kept her restless and alive? The answer lies somewhere between, for she never retreated into the shadows of domesticity, never allowed herself to be defined merely as a wife. Instead, she sharpened her tongue, honed her influence, and made their home into an extension of herself. The Longworth house was less a retreat from public life than another stage, one where Alice was both hostess and performer. Visitors often remarked on the sharpness of her commentary, the way she could puncture a man's reputation with a single phrase, or turn the entire table into laughter with an observation that teetered between cruelty and wit. Nicholas, though wounded at times, tolerated it, even seemed amused by it, for he knew this was Alice's way of inhabiting the world. Yet over the years, the strain wore at them, as water wears its stone, not always dramatic, but relentless. The press, of course, never ceased to follow her. Every appearance was noted, every remark recorded, every quarrel exaggerated. Alice seemed to live with this as naturally as others live with weather, adjusting to it, shaping herself against it, sometimes using it to her advantage. Nicholas, by contrast, endured it more wearily, his own career often overshadowed by his wife's fame. For while he was respected in Congress, it was Alice who became the household name. Alice whose antics reached the front pages. Alice whose wit was repeated across drawing rooms from Washington to New York. One might reflect here on the paradox of her life. In marrying Nicholas Longworth, she had fulfilled the social expectation of her era. She had secured a husband of stature, created an alliance of families, and staged a wedding that dazzled the nation. And yet, having fulfilled this role, she refused to be confined by it. Instead of retreating into the quiet duties of wifehood, she expanded her influence, turned marriage itself into another platform for her independence. In this sense, her marriage was less a surrender to convention than a transformation of it. But how did Nicholas feel, this man of gentler wit, living beside a woman whose flame so often overshadowed his own? Some said he admired her spirit, others that he tired of her constant need for spectacle. He continued his political climb, eventually reaching the position of Speaker of the House, a role of immense responsibility. Yet even then, Alice remained the more notorious figure, her presence in the gallery sometimes more remarked upon than his speeches on the floor. Perhaps he accepted this imbalance with humor, perhaps with resignation. Their marriage endured, but it was not a story of peaceful harmony. It was a story of coexistence, of friction that neither destroyed nor fully reconciled them. Imagine Alice in her parlor, reclining in a chair, cigarette in hand, surrounded by guests who lean forward to catch her words. Nicholas enters quietly, pours himself a glass of wine, and watches with a smile that is both affectionate and weary. This is their life together. Not absence, not unity, but a dance of presence and distance, always shifting, always unresolved. And so the brilliance of the White House wedding has dimmed into the softer light of domestic rooms, where laughter is mingled with tension, where companionship is mingled with solitude. Alice, who once dazzled the world with her marriage, now lives in the reality of it, complex, imperfect, but never ordinary. As the evening ends, the guests depart. The house grows quiet, and only the faint glow of a cigarette remains in the parlor, its smoke curling upward in the lamplight. Nicholas retreats to his study. Alice leans back into her chair, and the silence between them is filled not with despair, but with something subtler. Endurance, unresolved, like the faint trace of smoke lingering after the flame is gone. The smoke curling upward in the lamplight drifts into shadow, and from that shadow we begin to glimpse another chamber of Alice's life. Her transformation from restless daughter and dazzling bride into something more formidable, the Oracle of Washington. For as the years passed, her home became more than a domestic dwelling. It became a salon, a gathering place where politics was woven not only through speeches and legislation, but through conversation, laughter, and the cutting edge of wit. Visitors to the Longworth residence soon learned that Alice's parlor was no ordinary room. Statesmen, diplomats, journalists, and social figures alike found themselves drawn there, eager not only to be seen in her company, but to hear what she would say. She was not the hostess who flattered her guests with soft pleasantries. She was the hostess who tested them, teased them, exposed their weaknesses with a remark so sharp that it could leave a lasting mark. Yet, curiously, they returned again and again, for her words carried the thrill of danger and the allure of truth. In those gatherings, the atmosphere was charged. The scent of tobacco mingled with the clinking of glasses, the rustle of papers and laughter that often cut across the hum of polite talk. Alice would recline, cigarette in hand, her eyes half amused, half watchful. She spoke little at first, allowing conversation to flow, but when she entered, it was decisive. A quip, a jest, a sudden sharp phrase, and the room shifted. Sometimes laughter erupted, sometimes silence fell, but never was her remark forgotten. She had become what many feared and many adored, a woman whose tongue was a weapon, and whose opinion mattered even when uninvited. The power of such a presence lay not in office or title, but in influence. She whispered her observations into the ears of those who crafted policy, and those whispers traveled further than some speeches from the House floor. Politicians knew that her approval could sharpen their image. Her scorn could tarnish it. She did not flatter. She did not align herself slavishly to one camp. Instead, she cultivated an air of independence so that her remarks seemed the more dangerous, the more authentic. Her husband Nicholas, pursuing his path in Congress, may have felt both pride and unease at this. For while he was respected, Alice was notorious, and notoriety has a power of its own. She was a political force without office, an oracle without shrine, and yet men in positions of responsibility listened to her as if she were both prophet and jester. There is a story of her describing two political rivals with one of her famous quips, so precise that it spread like wildfire, quoted in newspapers and repeated in Congress itself. She did not need to publish manifestos. A single phrase could do more to shape reputation than columns of policy. Some feared her, some adored her, but none dismissed her. Her parlor became a place where reputations were made and unmade, where laughter disguised strategy, and where Alice herself presided like a queen who reigned not by decree, but by daring. What compelled her to wield this tongue, this wit that could be so cruel and yet so enchanting? Perhaps it was her inheritance from Theodore Roosevelt, whose vigor and candor had shaped his own political career. Yet in Alice it was turned inward, sharpened by solitude, refined by years of being both adored and scrutinized. Her tongue was her defense against dismissal, her weapon against invisibility, her shield against the silence of her earliest years. And so she wielded it tirelessly, with delight, with malice, with brilliance. But wit, like any blade, can wound as well as protect. Friends sometimes found themselves the targets of her scorn, and even those who loved her could not always escape the sting. She admitted little remorse, for to her the sharpness was honesty, a refusal to sugarcoat what others only whispered. Yet one wonders, did she ever lie awake, recalling words that had cut too deeply, wondering whether her laughter had turned to cruelty? Or did she accept it all as the price of living as herself, untamed, unyielding, unsoftened? Her home then was not a sanctuary but an arena. Guests came prepared for battle, their egos braced, their ears alert. They knew that to spar with Alice was to risk humiliation, but also to gain the thrill of her company. And perhaps this was the secret of her influence. People craved her approval, not because she gave it easily, but because she withheld it, granting it only when moved by genuine respect or amusement. To earn a word of praise from Alice Roosevelt was to carry a rare treasure, as rare as the pearls she once wore at her wedding. Washington began to recognize her not only as a figure of scandal, but as a figure of insight. Beneath her jokes there was often a piercing truth, an observation so clear that it cut through pretense. She was not a reformer, not a strategist, not a leader in the traditional sense, but she was a mirror held up to the political world, a mirror that refused to flatter, a mirror that revealed both absurdity and ambition in sharp relief. And in a city built on masks, that mirror was both feared and desired. Picture her there, in the dim glow of lamps, surrounded by the smoke of cigars and the murmur of voices. She leans forward, delivers a remark, and the room erupts, half in laughter, half in shock. Nicholas watches from the corner, his glass in hand, shaking his head with fond exasperation. The scene repeats itself night after night, year after year, until Alice's parlor becomes as legendary as the chambers of Congress. And yet, as the laughter fades and the guests depart, silence returns. The parlor is empty, the glasses left half full, the air still heavy with smoke. Alice reclines alone now, the sharpness gone from her lips, the wit resting quietly within her. Outside, Washington continues its ceaseless hum, but within, there's only the faint ticking of a clock, the sound of solitude filling the room. It is in that solitude, unresolved, that we leave her here, a woman who could command a room with her tongue, who could shape politics with her laughter, yet who, in the end, sat alone in the stillness, her influence drifting like smoke into the night. The silence of the parlor lingers, the faint ticking of a clock, the smoke fading into stillness. And from that stillness there arises another sound, the echo of her words carried beyond her own rooms, words that traveled into newspapers, into corridors of power, into the ears of presidents and first ladies. For Alice Roosevelt, Longworth was not content to keep her sharpness confined to salons. Her wit, once unleashed, crossed the threshold of private gatherings and entered the public stage, where it became both weapon and legend. She had a gift for distilling her judgments into phrases so memorable that they could not be ignored. One of her most famous remarks was about Calvin Coolidge, a man of few words. "He looks as though he had been weaned on a pickle," she said, and with that single phrase she captured an image that clung to him in the public mind. Such was her power, to define a man's reputation in a handful of words, to etch a caricature more lasting than a cartoonist's pen. Her barbs did not spare even those closest to her family's circle. She mocked the wives of politicians. She ridiculed senators. She even turned her tongue against sitting presidents. Her feud with Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, cousins who represented a different strain of the family's destiny, became notorious. Alice, who relished mischief, could not resist mocking Eleanor's earnestness, her moral seriousness, her tireless devotion to causes. Where Eleanor projected reform, Alice projected irreverence. The two women were like reflections in a distorted mirror, each embodying what the other rejected. Their rivalry played out not in direct confrontations, but in quips, in cold remarks, in gestures that spoke of distance rather than kinship. One might ask, why did Alice direct so much of her wit outward, turning her laughter into weapons? Perhaps because she understood that power is not always in office or position, but in influence. Her words, quoted endlessly, shaped perceptions more quickly than policy ever could. In a city where reputations were fragile, her tongue was a force no one could dismiss. She could undermine a man's dignity in a moment or elevate him with a rare word of approval. She did not govern, but she judged, and her judgments often outlasted legislation. Her remarks also revealed a philosophy, if one may call it that, a refusal to take the solemnity of politics too seriously, a recognition that power is always tinged with absurdity. In mocking leaders, she reminded the world that they were human, fallible, even ridiculous. Was this cruelty, or was it honesty? The line is blurred, for Alice often cloaked truth in humor, delivering it in such a way that people laughed even when they stung. Perhaps laughter was her way of piercing the veil of reverence that surrounded the powerful, stripping away their pretensions to reveal the common fragility beneath. Yet laughter can wound deeply. Not all her targets forgave her. Some considered her a menace, a distraction, a scandal who undermined the dignity of public life. Others feared her disapproval more than that of the press. And still, she thrived. Because in a world dominated by men, she had found a way to carve her own domain of authority. She could not vote in the early years of her life. She held no office, yet she shaped the atmosphere of Washington with her voice, alone. It is worth pausing to reflect on the paradox of this power. Women of her generation were often excluded from formal political life, yet Alice wielded an informal power that many office holders envied. Her parlor was a court, her wit the law, her laughter the judgment. In mocking others, she made herself indispensable, for who would not wish to know what Alice thought, even if they dreaded hearing it? She turned exclusion into influence, marginalization into mastery. Still, her sharpness carried a cost. Some friendships dissolved under the weight of her remarks. Some doors closed. At times she found herself isolated, not because society rejected her, but because her own tongue had carved a space around her that few dared to enter too closely. Did she regret this? Rarely, it seems, for Alice valued honesty above comfort, laughter above sentiment. She would rather risk loneliness than surrender her wit, and so she lived, admired and feared, surrounded by people who never truly knew whether they were safe in her company. Imagine a dinner party, the table glittering with glass and silver, the conversation flowing easily until Alice speaks. Her remark, sharp as a blade, slices through the air. Some laugh, some fall silent, the target flushes, the moment hangs heavy. Then the conversation resumes, altered, unsettled, alive with her presence. That was the power she carried, the ability to transform the mood of a room with a single phrase. Her feuds with presidents and their families revealed another truth. Alice had no loyalty but to herself. She did not hesitate to criticize her own kin, nor did she hesitate to support rivals when it suited her amusement. She lived as if allegiance were a costume to be donned or discarded at will. This made her unreliable as a political ally, but irresistible as a commentator. Her freedom was her strength. She owed nothing. She promised nothing, and therefore she could speak with abandon. And so we find her in this chapter, a woman without office yet with influence that stretched into every corner of Washington. Her tongue was feared, her laughter was remembered, her feuds became part of the city's lore. She was, in her way, a sovereign, not crowned but enthroned by the force of her personality. As the evening draws to a close, the image of Alice lingers. Cigarette in hand, her eyes glinting with mischief, her words still hanging in the air long after she has spoken them. Outside, the city hums with politics, but inside the echo of her voice remains, unresolved, like a question that lingers even after the laughter has died away. The echo of her voice lingers, a sharp remark still hanging in the air long after laughter has subsided, and from that echo we begin to trace its ripples outward, into the realm of dynasties, into the battles between families and factions that shaped American politics. For Alice Roosevelt, Longworth was not merely a presence of scandal and wit. She was also a hand, unseen yet undeniable, in the contests that determined the course of power. She never held office, never cast a vote in Congress, yet she influenced who would rise, who would falter, who would be remembered, and who would fade. Nowhere was this clearer than in the divide between Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, two men once bound by friendship, later sundered by rivalry. Theodore, Alice's father, had chosen Taft as his successor, believing the man's steady temperament and loyalty would safeguard the progress of his policies. But as Taft governed with a cautious hand, Theodore's restless ambitions surged anew, and soon he sought to reclaim the presidency. Alice, caught between father and party, chose her side with the same irreverence that marked all her decisions. She leaned toward Taft. Her support of Taft was not only political but also deeply personal, a quiet rebellion against the towering figure of her father. Perhaps she wished to carve her own path, to prove she was not merely an extension of Theodore's will, or perhaps she relished the mischief of standing in opposition to the man who had so often tried, unsuccessfully, to restrain her. Whatever the reason, her stance became emblematic of the split within the Republican Party, a fracture that would reshape American politics. Imagine the scene. Theodore, fiery and vigorous, launching his third-party campaign with the Bull Moose banner, while Alice, his own daughter, lent her wit and charm to the Taft camp. It was a spectacle of family divided, of dynasties fractured, and Washington delighted in the drama. For what could be more captivating than a father and daughter standing on opposite sides of a national contest? The newspapers seized upon it, painting Alice as both traitor and independent spirit, depending on their sympathies. And Alice, true to form, seemed to care little for the labels, reveling instead in the notoriety her choice afforded her. In the end, Taft lost, Theodore's Bull Moose campaign faltered, and Woodrow Wilson ascended to the presidency. But the fracture endured. a reminder that even the most powerful families could be undone by ambition. For Alice, the episode solidified her reputation as a woman who would not be bound even by blood. Her loyalty was to herself, her amusement, her independence. She would stand where she pleased, and no father, husband, or cousin could dictate her course. This role she played, of shaping dynasties through mischief, through wit, through defiance, extended beyond the Roosevelt-Taft divide. In the years that followed, she became an enduring presence in the shifting alignments of American politics. Presidents came and went, but Alice remained, her commentary slicing through their pretenses, her alliances shifting with her whims. She befriended some, mocked others, supported and betrayed with equal delight. In doing so, she revealed another truth: that influence is not always measured in offices held or laws passed, but in the subtle tilts of perception, the whispered words at dinners, the cutting phrases that shape reputations for years to come. Her family, too, was not immune to her tongue. The Roosevelts were a dynasty in themselves, sprawling across generations divided by ambition and philosophy. Alice's cousin Franklin, with his wife Eleanor, embodied a different vision of leadership: progressive, reformist, solemn in purpose. Alice could not resist mocking them, turning her sharpness against their causes and their characters. Some saw this as mere jealousy, others as ideological division, but perhaps it was something deeper, a recognition that within the same family lay competing destinies, and Alice, unwilling to yield her place, used her wit to carve her own legacy apart from theirs. Yet for all her mischief, for all her betrayals and barbs, Alice remained at the center. Politicians who might have shunned her instead sought her company, for they knew that her influence could not be ignored. She was like a fire, dangerous to approach, yet irresistible for the warmth and light she gave. To be seen in her parlor, to be quoted in her company, was to gain a measure of distinction, even when her laughter came at one's own expense. What is it, then, to shape dynasties without ever holding office? It is to understand that power is not only in votes or speeches, but in memory. Alice understood this instinctively. She knew that a reputation could be defined in a sentence, that a legacy could be bent by a jest, that a dynasty could be fractured by a daughter's choice. She was, in this sense, a custodian of perception, a mistress of the intangible realm where politics meets personality. And in that realm, she reigned. Still, we must ask, did she ever feel the weight of what she had done, supporting Taft against her father, mocking her cousins, shaping history with her laughter? Did she ever wonder whether her mischief had tipped balances that might have been steadier without her? Or did she, as always, embrace it with a smile, content that she had lived by her own will, even if the world judged her harshly? The truth remains elusive, coiled in her silence, unspoken beneath the mask of wit. And so we leave her in this chapter, seated once more in her parlor, a queen without a throne, shaping dynasties with words alone. Around her, the echoes of family rivalries linger, the fracture of parties, the tension of ambition. Her laughter carries across the room, bright and dangerous, while outside the city hums with politics, unaware of how deeply her unseen hand has tilted its course. The echo fades, but not entirely. It lingers, unresolved, like a shadow cast across the future, leading us toward the next scene of her life, the mirror held up to family itself, and the rivalry that would pit her wit against Eleanor Roosevelt's earnest gaze. The echo of dynastic fractures lingers, the faint shadow cast across the future, and from that shadow emerges another figure whose path wound both alongside and against Alice's own. Eleanor Roosevelt. Cousins by blood, contemporaries by history, the two women stood as mirrors of one another, though the reflection was often distorted, each embodying what the other resisted. Their relationship was not simply family kinship, but a long rivalry of temperament and destiny, unfolding across decades of American life. Eleanor was solemn, where Alice was irreverent. She was earnest, dutiful, driven by causes that sought reform, justice, and uplift. Alice, by contrast, disdained causes, mocked solemnity, and reveled in scandal and laughter. Eleanor moved through the world as though guided by moral responsibility, as though her life were a mission beyond herself. Alice moved as though the world were her stage, her laughter both curtain and crown. Together, they formed a pair as compelling as any tale of opposites: the reformer and the rebel, the conscience and the wit, the saint and the jester. It is said that Alice delighted in mocking Eleanor, finding in her seriousness a target too tempting to resist. Eleanor, with her quiet dignity, her careful words, her tireless energy for social reform, seemed to Alice unbearably sanctimonious. Where Eleanor saw injustice, Alice saw material for jest. Where Eleanor sought to inspire, Alice sought to deflate. Their exchanges, though rarely direct confrontations, became part of Washington's lore. Alice sneering from the sidelines, Eleanor pressing on with determination, each woman defining herself in opposition to the other. Consider, for instance, the years of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency, when Eleanor emerged as the nation's first lady, redefining the role with unprecedented activity. She traveled, she spoke, she championed the poor, the marginalized, the voiceless. She transformed the First Lady from a ceremonial hostess into a political actor. To many, she was a figure of inspiration. To Alice, she was insufferable. Alice quipped mercilessly about her cousin's appearance, her mannerisms, her righteousness. "She looks like a horse," Alice once said, a remark repeated with both laughter and scandal. It was cruel, yet it revealed how deeply Alice resisted the image of womanhood Eleanor embodied. But why this resistance? Was it mere jealousy, the sting of seeing another Roosevelt woman command the nation's gaze? Perhaps in part. For Alice had long been the spectacle of Washington, the woman everyone watched. Now Eleanor, with her quiet power, her earnest mission, captured attention in a different way. Yet beyond rivalry, there was also philosophy. Alice believed in the individual, in wit, in living freely without bowing to duty. Eleanor believed in duty above self, in sacrifice, in service. Their lives diverged at the root, shaped by different answers to the same question. What should a woman do with the gaze of the world upon her? And yet, for all their differences, one cannot help but see the hidden kinship. Both were extraordinary presences in a time that expected women to remain ordinary. Both defied the narrow roles assigned to them, though by different means. Alice mocked convention. Eleanor reshaped it. Alice used laughter. Eleanor used purpose. Each in her way stood apart from the patterns of their sex and station. Could it be that their rivalry masked a deeper recognition, that they were more alike than either would admit? The city, of course, delighted in their contrast. Newspapers quoted Alice's barbs, praised Eleanor's work, and turned their opposition into a tale of family drama. To the public, they became symbols of two Americas, one cynical, witty, untamed, the other earnest, reformist, solemn. Both were needed, perhaps, to reflect the contradictions of the age. For the nation, like Alice, loved to laugh at its leaders, yet like Eleanor, longed for someone to lift its conscience. Did they ever share a moment of true kinship, stripped of rivalry? Rarely, if ever. Their lives crossed at events, their words touched, but their hearts remained apart. Alice was too invested in mockery, Eleanor too invested in duty. Each lived according to her truth, unwilling to yield to the other. And so their rivalry became a fixture, enduring as long as they both lived, a reminder that family does not always bind, and that mirrors can reflect division as much as resemblance. It is tempting to imagine a scene. Alice in her parlor, cigarette smoke curling above her, delivering a cutting remark about Eleanor to the delight of her guests. Meanwhile, across town, Eleanor sits at her desk, writing letters to factory workers, speaking with quiet conviction about dignity and rights. Two women bound by blood, moving in opposite orbits, each convinced the other embodied what was wrong with the world. And yet, in that very opposition, each sharpened her own identity. Without Eleanor, Alice might have seemed merely frivolous. Without Alice, Eleanor might have seemed unbearably pious. Together, they created a contrast that illuminated them both. And so we are left to ponder. Did Alice truly despise Eleanor, or did she recognize in her a reflection of the seriousness she herself rejected? Did Eleanor truly disdain Alice, or did she recognize in her cousin the freedom she herself would never claim? The answers lie hidden, unspoken, buried beneath decades of rivalry. But perhaps the rivalry itself was the truest bond they shared, an unacknowledged intimacy forged in opposition. The echo of Alice's barbs fades into silence, while Eleanor's quiet words carry outward into the air, unresolved, like two melodies played in different keys, never harmonizing, yet together forming the strange music of a family divided by spirit. The two melodies, one sharp with wit, the other solemn with duty, drift apart into silence, and from that silence emerges a softer sound, the faint cry of a child in a quiet room. For beyond her parlor, beyond the salons and scandals, Alice Roosevelt Longworth was also a mother, and in her daughter Paulina we glimpse a different, more fragile side of her restless life. Paulina was born in 1925, when Alice was already in her 40s, long past the age at which most women of her world embraced motherhood. The birth itself carried with it a whisper of scandal, for rumors swirled that Paulina's father was not Nicholas Longworth, but Senator William Borah of Idaho, a man both charismatic and controversial, who had long been a presence in Alice's orbit. Whether rumor or truth, the speculation clung to the child's name like a shadow, unshakable in a city that thrived on whispers. Yet whatever her origins, Paulina became the center of Alice's private life, a rare point of tenderness in a woman better known for sharpness than for softness. Those who observed Alice with her daughter remarked upon her pride, but also her distance. Alice loved Paulina fiercely, but her love was often filtered through the lens of her own restless spirit. She was not the nurturing mother who devoted herself to domestic routines, nor the gentle presence who sheltered a child from the world. Instead, she was a figure of fascination and unpredictability, leaving Paulina to grow up in the shadow of both privilege and notoriety. In some ways, Paulina inherited her mother's loneliness, the same loneliness Alice herself had felt as a child after her own mother's death. History, it seemed, repeated its silences. Paulina was a sensitive soul, quiet where Alice was brash, uncertain where Alice was bold. She grew up under the weight of her mother's fame, her family's legacy, and the constant comparisons that such a lineage invited. To be Alice's daughter was not simply to be a child, but to be a symbol, a subject of speculation, a link in the long chain of Roosevelt influence. And yet Paulina, unlike her mother, did not thrive beneath the gaze of others. She shrank from it, retreating into books, into stillness, into the safety of shadows. Alice, for her part, seemed both bewildered and frustrated by her daughter's temperament. She loved her, but she did not always understand her. Her own defiance, her sharp wit, her relentless pursuit of freedom found no echo in Paulina's quiet reserve. Where Alice had met loneliness with rebellion, Paulina met it with timidity. The bond between them was thus tender but strained, filled with affection but also distance, as though mother and daughter belonged to different worlds of spirit. It is a curious irony. Alice, who had spent her life defying expectations, found herself longing for her daughter to embody the very strength she herself had cultivated. She wanted Paulina to be bold, to be fearless, to seize life with both hands. But Paulina, burdened by her mother's brilliance, could not. And so Alice's love became laced with disappointment, not rejection, but the sorrow of a mother unable to draw her child into her own rhythm. There were moments of tenderness, of course. Alice was not devoid of affection. She delighted in her daughter's company, boasted of her beauty, and watched over her with a vigilance that sometimes masked itself as criticism. Yet beneath it all was an unspoken truth. Alice's life had not prepared her for motherhood of the gentle kind. She had learned to survive by wit, by spectacle, by rebellion, and these tools, so effective in society, were ill-suited to the private world of raising a child. Paulina's adulthood would carry this tension forward. She struggled with her own sense of identity, with the pressures of being a Roosevelt, with the shadow of her mother's dazzling but merciless presence. She married. She bore a daughter of her own, but she also suffered deeply, retreating into melancholy. In 1957, at the age of 31, she died suddenly, leaving behind her young child and a mother who, for all her wit and sharpness, could not mock away the sorrow. Alice rarely spoke of Paulina's death, perhaps because the grief was too sharp, perhaps because words, her most constant companions, finally failed her. And yet, through Paulina's daughter, Joanna, the line of Alice continued. Alice became a grandmother, and in that role perhaps found a gentler affection than she had been able to offer her own child. Still, the wound of Paulina's life and death never fully left her. Beneath her laughter, beneath her quips, beneath her sparkling eyes, there lingered the shadow of loss once more, the same shadow that had marked her own childhood. In this, the circle of sorrow closed. Alice, the child born into absence, became Alice, the mother who buried her child. It is here that we glimpse the cost of a restless spirit. For rebellion, dazzling though it may be, does not always harmonize with the fragile needs of intimacy. Alice's greatness as a wit, as a presence, as a scandal, was also her burden as a mother. She could not soften herself, she could not quiet herself, and so she could not always provide the solace her daughter craved. Paulina, gentle and uncertain, needed tenderness more than brilliance, and Alice, for all her love, could not give it. One wonders, in her quietest moments, did Alice reproach herself? Did she lie awake in her later years, replaying words spoken too sharply, gestures withheld, laughter that masked concern? Or did she, true to her nature, shield herself from remorse with irony, refusing to dwell upon what could not be undone? The truth, as ever with Alice, is hidden, coiled between laughter and silence, and so the melody of rivalry with Eleanor fades into this softer refrain, the lullaby of a child's cry, the silence of a mother's grief. Alice, who had once carried a snake in her handbag to amuse and shock, now carried the absence of her daughter in the deepest chambers of her being. The world still saw her sparkle, but within, a shadow lengthened. The cry of the child drifts away, unresolved, leaving only the faint sound of a page turning in a book. Paulina's refuge, and perhaps now Alice's memory, as we step into the next movement of her restless, unyielding life. The faint sound of a page turning lingers in the quiet, as though Paulina's hand still rests upon the book, and from that fragile sound we step into another chamber of Alice's life, one where grief and resilience entwine. For though her daughter's absence left a wound that never fully closed, Alice did not retreat from the world. Instead, as though determined never to yield to sorrow, she returned once more to the salons and banquets of Washington, sharpening her tongue anew, filling her rooms again with smoke, laughter, and whispers. It was in these years that her role as oracle became more pronounced. She was no longer the restless debutante with a snake in her handbag, nor the dazzling bride commanding 1,000 guests. She was now a woman of age and reputation, a figure whose presence carried the authority of decades. Her parlor was again alive with conversation, but it was no longer mere amusement. It was consultation, observation, judgment. Politicians, journalists, ambassadors, all sought her words, not simply for laughter, but for insight. Alice had become the city's mirror, reflecting back its follies and ambitions, its truths and pretenses. Her grief, though seldom spoken, seemed to have sharpened her wit rather than softened it. If once her barbs had been playful, they now carried an edge honed by sorrow. She had lost much: her mother before she could remember, her daughter before she was ready to let go. And in that losing, she had little patience for sentiment or illusion. Her laughter was still quick, her jokes still merciless, but beneath them lay the weight of someone who had seen enough to know how fragile reputations, ambitions, and lives could be. Visitors to her home often described the strange combination of delight and fear she inspired. To be in Alice's company was to enter a space of electricity, where one never knew whether her next remark would elevate or eviscerate. Her eyes, bright with mischief, scanned the room as though forever hunting for her next quarry. A guest might arrive with confidence, only to leave humbled by a quip that would be repeated across the city by morning. Yet many still returned, for her approval was coveted, her presence intoxicating, her conversation unlike any other. She was, in a sense, Washington's necessary danger. It was in these years, too, that her reputation as a gossip was both solidified and exalted. She seemed to know everything about everyone, and her delight in sharing what she knew was legendary. Yet her gossip was not idle. It was strategic, laced with insight. She could strip away the false grandeur of a senator with a story from his past, or she could inflate the mystique of a young politician with a rumor carefully placed. In this way, her parlor became not merely a place of talk, but a place of power, where reputations were shaped as surely as in the chambers of government. Her sharpness spared no one, not even herself. "I have a simple philosophy," she once quipped. "Fill what's empty, empty what's full, and scratch where it itches." It was a jest, but it was also a creed, a refusal to be bound by solemnity, a declaration that life was to be lived with irreverence and candor. She mocked her own aging, her own scandals, her own grief, as though laughter itself were her shield against despair. Still, one wonders what silence lay behind the laughter. Did Alice, in the solitude of her evenings, feel the weight of Paulina's absence pressing upon her? Did she remember the daughter who had sought refuge in books, whose turning pages now seemed like whispers from another world? Perhaps she did, but she cloaked it in irony, refusing to let sorrow rob her of her defiance. For Alice's greatest rebellion in the end was not against society, but against despair itself. Her presence at Washington's events became a constant, a reminder of continuity across decades of change. Presidents came and went, wars rose and fell, but Alice remained, her sharpness undimmed, her laughter still echoing in corridors where policies were debated and destinies shaped. She was like an ancient oracle perched upon the city's shoulder, half feared, half adored, never ignored. Imagine her at a dinner party in these years, seated at the head of the table, her gown elegant though her figure aged, her eyes as piercing as ever. Around her sit men of power, some young, some old, all aware that their words may be judged, their manner mocked, their ambitions exposed. She listens, she watches, and then, with a flick of her wrist and a turn of phrase, she alters the air of the evening. Laughter erupts, or silence falls, depending on her choice. She remains in control, even without office, even without title. It is her gift, her legacy, her dominion. And yet, beneath the performance, one might glimpse a shadow. For the role of oracle is also lonely. To preside over conversations as judge and jester is to remain apart, never fully embraced, always the one who comments rather than confides. Alice, for all her company, lived often in solitude, her laughter masking the silence of her nights. The turning of Paulina's page still echoes, even if faintly, reminding us that beneath every jest lies a story unsaid. And so we leave her here, once again in her parlor, surrounded by admirers and rivals, her wit cutting the air like a blade, her laughter filling the room, while within her, unspoken, the page of a lost daughter remains forever turning. The page of Paulina's book turns endlessly in memory, and as its sound fades, it is replaced by another rhythm, deeper and more relentless. The pulse of a world at war, the shifting beat of nations in turmoil. For as Alice grew older, the world around her transformed, and yet she remained, luminous and sharp, a presence that outlasted the rise and fall of men and empires. Her life, once the scandal of Washington parlors, now stretched across decades of upheaval, and she watched, amused and scornful, as new figures took the stage while she retained her throne of commentary. The First World War had already passed, and Alice had witnessed its toll on friends, family, and the very fabric of society. But it was the Second World War, vast and consuming, that brought a new gravity to the Washington she knew so well. Politicians no longer quarreled over petty disputes alone. The fate of continents hung in their decisions. And yet, even amid this gravity, Alice continued to wield her wit. She had no patience for the inflated rhetoric of statesmen, no reverence for leaders who cloaked their ambitions in solemn tones. She mocked, she laughed, she whispered her judgments into the ears of those who listened. And they did listen, for even in the shadow of war, her voice carried weight. Her cousin Franklin now occupied the White House, Eleanor at his side, and this only sharpened her role as both insider and critic. She could not resist mocking the administration, offering barbs at Franklin's policies, sneers at Eleanor's activism. Yet for all her derision, she remained part of the world they inhabited, her presence in Washington society undiminished. To many, she was the dissenting voice of a family otherwise enshrined in history, the irreverent reminder that no dynasty is without fracture. As the war consumed the globe, Alice grew older, but she did not retreat. Instead, she carried herself with the same irreverence, though now tempered by the authority of age. She had become a relic, yes, but a living relic, one whose memories stretched back to the turn of the century, to the days when her father had charged into battle and she herself had carried a snake in her handbag. Younger generations regarded her with fascination, some with awe, some with impatience. To them, she was a bridge to another era, a voice that linked the world of Theodore Roosevelt and William Taft to the world of Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman. She was, in her way, a living chronicle. And yet, unlike the solemn chroniclers of history, Alice insisted on laughter. She refused to treat the past as sacred. She mocked her father's piety as easily as she mocked Franklin's fireside chats. She turned memory into jest, history into anecdote, sorrow into irony. Was this defiance, or was it her way of surviving the passage of time? Perhaps both. For to grow old in Washington is to watch wave after wave of new ambition rise and fall, and Alice, who had lived so long in the gaze of others, refused to surrender to invisibility. She kept herself luminous through wit, through audacity, through the unyielding refusal to grow solemn. The wars ended, the world reshaped itself, presidents came and went, but Alice endured. Her home remained a salon, her presence a necessity, her commentary a fixture in the city's fabric. Men who had fought in foreign lands returned to seek her judgment, to listen to her laughter, to measure themselves against her sharpness. Women who had entered public life found in her both inspiration and warning, a woman who had commanded attention without reform, who had shaped politics without office, who had lived untamed but also alone. Her aging did not diminish her wit. If anything, it sharpened it. She grew more fearless, less restrained, mocking death itself with her remarks. "If you can't say something good about someone," she once said, "sit right here by me." The quip, repeated endlessly, became her epitaph in life, a symbol of her unrepentant irreverence. It was cruel, yes, but also liberating, a reminder that truth can be cloaked in laughter, that power lies not only in deeds but in words. Yet behind the sharpness was a question that lingered. Did Alice ever tire of the role she had created for herself? To be forever the jester, the oracle, the wit. Was it enough? Did she long for moments of quiet recognition, of gentleness unmocked, of affection unbarbed? Perhaps. But she rarely allowed such longings to surface. Instead, she cloaked herself in the character she had perfected, and the city accepted her as such. She was Alice, the untamed, the unrepentant, the eternal gadfly of Washington. Imagine her in these later years, seated in her parlor as she always had been, her figure thinner now, her hair silvered, her eyes still gleaming with mischief. Around her gather younger men and women, eager to hear her stories of an earlier age. She tells them of Theodore, of banquets, of snakes and scandals, each tale delivered with a wink and a sting. They laugh, they marvel, they record her words in notebooks, knowing they are in the presence of living history. Yet when the laughter fades and the guests depart, she sits alone, the silence of her house deepened by the years, the ticking of the clock unchanged. Outside, the pulse of the city continues. The wars have ended, the powers have shifted, but Alice remains, luminous in her defiance, unsoftened by time. She's become a legend, even as she still breathes, and legends, like wars, reshape the world. The pulse of history beats on, unresolved, and we leave her here, suspended between laughter and silence, a relic and yet alive, her presence as bright and as restless as ever. The pulse of history softens, its beat receding into the distance like the echo of drums after a parade has passed, and in its place we hear again the hush of a room, a smaller, quieter room than before. The great salons of Washington still called Alice Roosevelt Longworth their oracle, but as she aged into her 70s and beyond, the gatherings grew less formal, more intimate, and yet no less charged with anticipation. Her parlor, though dimmed by years, retained its air of expectation, for her presence alone was enough to make the air electric. Guests continued to come, younger now, eager to hear stories of a time before their own, to glimpse in her the twinkle of history alive. She sat often in her high-backed chair, cigarette in hand, the smoke drifting lazily toward the ceiling, her figure thinner but still commanding. Age had curved her spine, slowed her steps, but her tongue remained unbent. The wit that had once startled presidents and scandalized first ladies still flashed with sudden brilliance, leaving her guests both delighted and wary. They leaned forward, awaiting her remarks, aware that at any moment she might turn her gaze upon them and fix their place in her memory with a phrase too sharp to escape. In these twilight salons, Alice became something rarer still, a witness to nearly a century of Washington. She remembered Theodore's Rough Riders, the banquets of foreign dignitaries, the splendor of her White House wedding, the fractures of parties, the rise of Franklin and Eleanor, the wars that reshaped the globe. All these she carried not as solemn records, but as anecdotes, sharpened into jest, softened into irony. Her guests, younger politicians and journalists, marveled that she had seen so much, spoken to so many, lived through such upheaval, and still mocked it all with laughter. There was a twinkle in her eye even as her body weakened, a mischievous light that seemed to say, "I have seen it all, and still nothing can tame me." That twinkle made her rooms glow with a warmth not entirely explained by the lamps. It drew people in, even those who feared her sting. For the sting remained. Her remarks could still wound, still expose, still linger in the memory of her listeners like the cut of a blade. Age had not softened her cruelty, but it had refined it, stripped it of excess, leaving only the essence of her wit, quick, piercing, unforgettable. Some wondered if she saw herself as a guardian of history, a custodian of memory. She certainly had the right, for few alive could claim to have witnessed so much, and fewer still could speak of it with her clarity. Yet Alice resisted the solemnity of the role. She did not lecture, did not compose careful reflections. Instead, she delivered history as anecdote, as jest, as gossip. For her, memory was not marble carved with reverence, but glass fractured by laughter, shards that glittered even as they cut. She never allowed the past to become sacred. She turned it instead into entertainment, into sharp lessons disguised as jokes. Still, behind her irony, there was a silence she did not share. Alone at night, when the guests had gone and the smoke had settled, she must have felt the weight of her years, the long shadows of those she had outlived. Nicholas was gone. Paulina was gone. Her cousins who had ruled the White House were gone, and yet she endured. Longevity, admired by many, can also be a burden, for it means carrying the memory of absences as much as presences. Alice bore this burden as she bore all others, with laughter, with irony, with the armor of wit. But the silence must have whispered to her, as silence always does. Picture her parlor in these years. The wallpaper faded, the carpets worn, the furniture familiar from decades past. On the mantel, photographs of family and friends, many of them long dead. The clock ticks softly, the fire crackles, the air carries the faint scent of tobacco and perfume. Guests sit in a circle, their faces turned toward Alice, waiting. She pauses, leans forward, delivers her line, and the room bursts into laughter. For a moment the decades dissolve, and she is once again the young woman who shocked Washington with her daring. Yet when the laughter subsides, her gaze drifts toward the fire, her cigarette burns low, and the silence presses in once more. Was she lonely in these years? Perhaps. Yet loneliness for Alice was never a surrender. She turned it outward, made it part of her performance, cloaked it in mischief. Her solitude became another jest, her mortality another target for her tongue. "If I had my life to live over again," she once remarked, "I'd make all the same mistakes, only sooner." The line, as always, drew laughter, but within it lies a confession that her mistakes were her essence, that her life was defined not by restraint, but by rebellion, and that she would not have changed it. And so, in the hush of her twilight salons, Alice Roosevelt Longworth remained untamed. The twinkle in her eye endured, the sting in her words remained sharp, the laughter rose and fell like music in rooms otherwise quiet with age. She was history itself, made flesh and voice, refusing to yield to solemnity, refusing to be softened by time. We leave her here, in that parlor of shadows and light, cigarette in hand, the fire casting its glow upon her face, her eyes bright with mischief even as the years weighed upon her. Outside, Washington moved on, but within, the oracle still reigned, unresolved, suspended between memory and laughter, her voice echoing softly in the hush. The twinkle in her eye lingers in the firelight, dancing above the embers like a spark that refuses to fade. And from that spark, we enter another layer of her being, the contradictions that made Alice Roosevelt Longworth impossible to contain in any simple portrait, for she was both glamour and loneliness, both rebellion and belonging, both laughter and silence. These opposites did not cancel one another. They coexisted, woven together in the tapestry of her long life, and it was in this weaving that her true mystery resided. She lived her days as a creature of spectacle, surrounded by banquets, salons, and conversations that shaped the fate of nations. Yet beneath this spectacle, there ran a vein of solitude, unacknowledged, but undeniable. The little girl who had grown up shadowed by the loss of her mother, the woman who had buried her only child, remained within her, even as she laughed and mocked and dazzled. Those who saw her twinkling eyes may not have noticed the shadow behind them, but it was there, a reminder that wit is often born of sorrow. And still, she adorned herself in elegance, her gowns, her jewels, her posture. She carried them like armor, outward signs of the glamour that she projected. Even in old age, when her body thinned and her hair silvered, she maintained an aura of sophistication, a dignity sharpened by mischief. To her guests, she appeared untouchable, almost immortal, a figure who had outlasted generations, who seemed destined to sit forever in her parlor with cigarette and smile. Yet glamour is often a veil, and beneath it she must have known the loneliness of survival, the ache of being the one left behind, the last voice in a chorus that had long since gone quiet. Her rebellion, too, was a paradox. She lived as though rules did not apply to her, mocking presidents, defying conventions, turning expectations into jokes. She reveled in scandal, delighted in shocking society, made her life itself a defiance of propriety. And yet, for all her rebellion, she belonged utterly to Washington. She was as much a fixture of the Capitol as the dome of the Capitol building, as much a part of its lore as the White House itself. She mocked its rituals, yet she never abandoned them. She scorned its leaders, yet she hosted them in her home. She lived outside its order, yet she was its most vivid symbol. Her rebellion was not departure, but transformation. She defied by remaining within, turning the very heart of society into her stage. Perhaps it was this blend of belonging and rebellion that gave her such longevity. Others faded when they rejected society entirely or submitted to it completely. Alice did neither. She hovered in the space between, both inside and outside, both participant and critic, and in that liminal space, she thrived. Like smoke curling above a candle, she was there and not there, present and elusive, impossible to grasp, yet impossible to ignore. Her remarks about death, delivered with the same irony that defined her life, reveal this tension most clearly. She often spoke of mortality with a shrug, as though mocking even the inevitable. "I am a hedonist," she once said, by politics, ancestry, instinct, and experience. Such words carried both bravado and resignation, as if she knew that death would come but refused to grant it solemnity. Another time, when asked about her age, she quipped, "First you're young, then you're middle-aged, then you're wonderful." In her old age, she declared herself wonderful, mocking the decline that others dreaded, turning the passage of time into another jest. Even as death approached, she would not surrender her laughter. But was this mockery of mortality mere performance, or was it her way of wrestling with fear? To laugh at death is to strip it of its power, to refuse to bow before it, to deny it the satisfaction of dread. Perhaps Alice's jokes were her shield, her final rebellion against the one rule none can escape. Yet perhaps, in the quiet after laughter, she felt the weight of it, the silence that comes when guests depart and the fire dies down. For even the sharpest wit cannot undo the loneliness of the inevitable. Her contradictions made her endlessly fascinating. She could be cruel and compassionate in the same breath, mocking a man's vanity while offering comfort to a grieving friend. She could scorn the solemnity of causes while defending the dignity of the forgotten with her sharpest barbs. She could live as a rebel while remaining the most faithful symbol of Washington society. These contradictions were not inconsistencies. They were her truth. She was a woman too vast to be confined to a single role, a spirit too restless to be pinned down by labels. In these later years, as she reclined in her parlor with cigarette in hand, her guests often asked her about eternity. They longed for wisdom, for solemn reflection, for some distillation of all she had seen. But Alice gave them irony instead. "I suppose I'll have to live with those people forever," she said of death, "and it will be perfectly awful." The remark, like so many others, drew laughter, but behind it lay an acknowledgement that eternity itself could not tame her spirit, that she would mock even the company of the afterlife. In this way, she prepared herself not with prayer, but with jest, as though laughter were the only way to cross the threshold. And so we glimpse her contradictions in the glow of the fire, the twinkle in her eye and the shadow behind it, the wit on her tongue and the silence in her heart, the rebel who belonged, the glamorous woman who carried loneliness, the mortal who mocked eternity. These contradictions were her essence, the reason she could not be forgotten, the reason her story endures. The fire burns low, the cigarette ashes fall softly into the tray, her laughter echoes once more, and then the room is quiet. The contradictions remain unresolved, suspended in the air like smoke, leading us onward toward the final years of her extraordinary life. The contradictions linger in the air like smoke, and as the room grows still, we sense another silence settling, deeper than before. The silence of old age, of time stretching thin, of eternity drawing near. Alice Roosevelt Longworth, once the wildest daughter of America, the oracle of salons, the scourge of presidents, lived on into her 90s, outlasting nearly everyone who had once shared her stages. In those final decades, she became less a participant in Washington's drama and more a witness, a living legend whose very survival turned her presence into history itself. Her home in Washington, the same house on Massachusetts Avenue where she had lived for so many years, became a shrine of memory. Its walls were lined with photographs of people long gone. Her father, Theodore, vigorous and young, Nicholas, her husband, with his gentle smile, Paulina, her daughter, forever youthful in the captured image, and cousins Franklin and Eleanor, whose shadows still fell across the century. To visitors, these photographs were relics, reminders of eras past. To Alice, they were companions of a kind, silent but unyielding, staring back at her as she reclined in her chair with cigarette in hand. She lived surrounded by ghosts, yet she refused to become one herself. Even in her 90s, she entertained visitors with the same wit, the same twinkle in her eye, the same sting in her words. Reporters came to interview her, young politicians sought her blessing or feared her scorn, and society figures visited to marvel at the endurance of a woman who had once shocked the Capitol with her snake and her cigarettes. They found her sharp as ever, mocking her own age with irony. "I'm a witch," she declared, "and it's a good thing. It keeps people on their toes." Her humor cloaked her frailty, as it always had, turning mortality into jest. Washington by then had changed utterly. The city she had known as a young woman, filled with carriages and banquets, had transformed into a metropolis of motorcades and skyscrapers. The names of presidents that once stirred passion, Taft, Wilson, Harding, were now memories in history books, their portraits fading on walls. Yet Alice remained, her life bridging a century, her stories connecting the old world to the new. She was like an oak tree rooted deep, branches weathered by storms, still standing long after the forest around her had shifted. Visitors often remarked upon the strange feeling of stepping into her house. It was as though they had entered a different era, one where conversation carried the weight of gossip that had toppled reputations, where the scent of tobacco mingled with the perfume of memory, where every piece of furniture seemed worn by decades of laughter and loss. Alice presided over it all like a queen in exile, her throne not gilded but upholstered, her crown not jeweled but carried in the sharpness of her words. And yet, for all the admiration and fascination she inspired, her later years were also marked by solitude. She had outlived her daughter, her husband, her cousins, most of her friends. The banquets of her youth were gone, the salons of her middle years thinned by time, and though visitors still came, they could not fill the absence of those she had lost. The child who had grown up in shadows, the woman who had buried her child, now lived in a house of shadows once more. The irony was sharp. Alice, who had spent her life commanding attention, ended it surrounded by silence. But Alice turned even this into performance. She mocked death itself, referring to it as an annoyance rather than a terror. She claimed she would haunt Washington, that she would continue to gossip from beyond the grave. Her defiance of solemnity never wavered, even as her body grew frail. She treated age as she had treated convention all her life, with irreverence. To those who came to see her, she remained the same Alice, unsoftened, untamed, unrepentant. One can imagine her in those final years, seated in her familiar chair, the light from the window falling across her face, her eyes still gleaming though her hands trembled, the cigarette burning slowly between her fingers. Around her, the photographs stare, silent witnesses to a century. She speaks, and her words cut through the quiet like they always had. Her guests laugh, they marvel, they leave with stories to tell. And when the door closes, she sits again in silence. The tick of the clock reminding her that time, too, has its sharpness. What did she think in those solitary hours? Did she reflect on the wild girl who had smoked on the White House roof, on the bride who had commanded 1,000 guests, on the mother who had buried her child, on the oracle who had mocked presidents? Did she regret? Did she long for gentleness? Or did she, as always, shrug and laugh at the absurdity of it all? Perhaps the truth lies in all of these, woven together, contradictions as inseparable in death as in life. Alice Roosevelt Longworth lived until 1980, nearly a full century after her birth. She had watched the world transform from horse-drawn carriages to moon landings, from telegrams to television. She had mocked her way through wars, through presidencies, through dynasties rising and falling. And when she died, at the age of 96, the city paused, as though a bright spark had finally flickered out. Yet, even in death, her words remained, repeated in newspapers and memoirs, quoted in conversations, etched into the memory of a capital she had both scandalized and enchanted. Her house became quiet, its parlor empty, its photographs staring without her to animate them. The laughter that had filled its rooms for decades was gone, replaced by the silence of absence. And yet, in the minds of those who remembered, her voice still echoed, her quips still cut, her twinkle still shone. She had defied mortality by becoming legend, and legends, unlike lives, do not end so neatly. And so we leave her here, in her house of shadows and memories, surrounded by ghosts yet still alive in laughter, her story not concluded but carried forward in every retelling. The silence of eternity hovers, unresolved, as though even death could not fully close the curtain on Alice Roosevelt Longworth. The silence of her house lingers, the photographs unmoving, the clock ticking with unbroken rhythm, and from this hush we come to the final curtain of her life. In February of 1980, Alice Roosevelt Longworth, 96 years old, drew her last breath in the city that had been her stage for nearly a century. The news spread quickly, though not with shock. Her longevity had long made her seem indestructible, and many had wondered if she might live forever. Yet when the announcement came, Washington paused, as though a familiar light had suddenly gone out, leaving the rooms dimmer than before. Her death was marked not only by obituaries, but by memories, by countless retellings of her sharpest quips, her most scandalous gestures, her laughter that had once filled parlors and unsettled presidents. Journalists who had interviewed her in her later years recalled her wit still sharp, her humor still irreverent, even when her body had grown frail. Politicians of younger generations marveled that she had lived to see them rise, just as she had seen their predecessors, and some confessed that her approval, or her mockery, had mattered more than they dared admit. To die at 96 is to die as the last of an era, and Alice's passing marked the close of a chapter not only in her family's saga, but in the life of the Capitol itself. In Washington, there was a sense that history itself had shifted. She had been a thread connecting the Roosevelt White House of the early 20th century with the modern age of television and global politics. She had walked beside princes and diplomats, quarreled with presidents, mocked her own cousins, outlived wars and reforms, scandals and revolutions. Her life had spanned the Spanish-American War her father had fought, the Great Depression, the Second World War, the Atomic Age, the Cold War. Few individuals had lived through so much, and fewer still had watched it all with such irony. Her funeral, though solemn, carried echoes of her irreverence. Friends and admirers gathered to remember her, yet even in mourning they could not resist repeating her quips, as though her voice still demanded to be heard. One said she had mocked even death, calling it a bore, and declaring she would be gossiping in the afterlife. Another recalled her words, "If you can't say something good about someone, sit right here by me." They laughed even as they wept, for her memory could not be separated from her wit. In death, as in life, she refused solemnity. What did Washington feel at her absence? A peculiar emptiness, as though a guardian of its follies had vanished. For Alice had been more than a celebrity, more than a socialite. She had been its conscience in jest, its mirror in mockery, the voice that reminded leaders they were mortal, that their grandeur was always tinged with absurdity. Without her, the city seemed less self-aware, less punctured by laughter. She had been the gadfly who refused to be swatted, and her death left the air strangely still. And yet the questions lingered. Who was Alice Roosevelt Longworth truly? Was she the rebel daughter, carrying her snake in defiance of convention? Was she the witty oracle, shaping dynasties with her barbs? Was she the glamorous hostess, dazzling foreign dignitaries with her charm? Or was she the lonely mother, grieving her daughter in silence? Perhaps she was all of these, contradictions woven into one. To define her by a single role is to diminish her. She lived too long, too wildly, too sharply to be confined. There is something haunting in her end. The child who entered the world in tragedy, losing her mother within hours of her birth, became the woman who left it surrounded by shadows. Her daughter long gone, her family scattered, her friends mostly departed. And yet, through all this loss, she had never surrendered her laughter. It was her shield, her weapon, her crown. She laughed at presidents, at rivals, at herself, at death. In doing so, she left behind not merely a record of words, but a way of being. Defiance through humor, survival through irony. Imagine the city in the days after her death. The White House still stood, its windows glowing in the winter dusk. Congress still quarreled, the press still rushed to print headlines. Life went on, as it always does. But in certain parlors, at certain dinners, there was an emptiness, a pause where once her laughter had filled the air. Her name was spoken softly, then louder, then repeated in anecdotes, until the memory itself became a new kind of presence. For legends do not die with their bodies. They live on in retellings, in laughter shared again and again, in the questions they leave unresolved. And so Alice Roosevelt Longworth's death was not an ending, but a transformation. She became memory. She became legend. She became a figure who haunted Washington not as a ghost in shadow, but as a voice in its laughter, a twinkle in its eye, a sting in its tongue. She had refused to be tamed in life, and in death she refused to be silenced. The city paused, the photographs on her mantel grew still, the clock ticked on. Yet her spirit lingered, unresolved, leading us into the final reflection. How should we remember her, this woman who refused definition, who mocked solemnity, who lived as though eternity itself were merely another jest? The hush of her funeral lingers, the murmurs of mourners fading into the still air of Washington. And from that hush there rises not solemnity alone, but the sound of memory itself, a sound that cannot be silenced. For Alice Roosevelt Longworth, even in death, was not content to be laid to rest quietly. Her presence continued in anecdotes, in the words of those who had known her, in the countless retellings of her sharp remarks and scandalous gestures. She had spent a lifetime refusing to be confined, and even the grave could not contain her spirit. As the city resumed its routines in those days after her passing, one could sense her echo in unexpected places. In the halls of Congress, where men once feared her judgment, her name was spoken with reluctant admiration. In the White House, where her laughter had scandalized and unsettled presidents, her absence was felt like a missing spark. In the parlors of society, where younger hostesses tried to mimic her style, the comparisons inevitably fell short. And in the quiet of libraries, where journalists thumbed through decades of clippings, her words leapt from the pages as fresh and biting as when they were first uttered. What, then, is the measure of a life such as hers? Not legislation passed, not policies shaped, not monuments built. Rather, it is the influence of presence, the force of personality, the power of words to shape memory and perception. Alice held no office, yet she shaped politics. She led no armies, yet she influenced reputations as surely as battles alter maps. She did not reform society, yet she exposed its absurdities with laughter that cut more deeply than sermons. Her life reminds us that history is not written only by those in power, but also by those who stand beside power, mocking, commenting, refusing to be silenced. And yet her legacy is not simple. She was witty, yes, but also cruel. She was bold, but often reckless. She was glamorous, but carried loneliness in her heart. She was adored, but also feared. To remember her is to hold contradictions in balance, as she herself did, never resolving them, but letting them coexist. Perhaps this is her final gift, the reminder that human lives are not tidy narratives, but restless tapestries of light and shadow, laughter and silence. Some called her the wildest first daughter, others the Empress of Washington, others still a relic who lived too long. But she herself might have chosen a different title, the woman who would not be tamed. From the White House roof where she smoked her first rebellious cigarette, to the salons where she mocked presidents, to the quiet house where she endured loss and age, she remained untamed, unwilling to bend her spirit to convention. She lived on her own terms, and in doing so, she carved a place in history as indelible as any carved in stone. We might imagine her now, not lying in silence beneath the earth, but still seated in her familiar parlor, cigarette in hand, the smoke curling upward, her eyes glinting with mischief. Around her, the ghosts of her companions gather. Her father with his booming laugh, Nicholas with his glass of wine, Paulina turning the pages of her book, Franklin and Eleanor regarding her with wary curiosity. She speaks, delivers a remark, and the room bursts into laughter. Even among the dead, she cannot be silenced, cannot be solemn. Eternity itself becomes another salon, another stage for her wit, and perhaps that is how we should remember her, not as a saint, not as a villain, but as a presence. A woman who inhabited her century with audacity, who reminded a solemn city of its absurdity, who bore her grief with irony, who laughed in the face of death. Her story is not a moral tale, not an example to be followed or condemned. It is a life lived fiercely, a spirit refusing domestication, a twinkle that outlasted the shadows around it. As we close this long remembrance, let us linger one last time in the house on Massachusetts Avenue. The chairs are empty now. The photographs stare silently. The fire has burned out. The clock ticks steadily in the hush. And yet, if we listen closely, we can still hear it. The sound of laughter, sharp and unrepentant, echoing through the rooms. It is Alice's laughter, carried into eternity, refusing to fade. And so her story ends, not with silence, but with that laughter, unresolved, untamed, eternal.